From Australia to Austria, you have joined us today for the 1-hour panel from 24 Hour Nation. Thank you for doing so. The topic is Agent of Change and other policies and practices that can help the sounds from entertainment-related businesses live harmoniously with the community and vice versa. My guests are Brian Block. He's the Entertainment Services Manager for the City of Austin, Texas's self-proclaimed live music capital of the world. He's also president of Nightcap Alliance. It's the network of professionals who are responsible for nighttime economy management, advocacy, and planning in the United States. Mark David, the CEO and founder of Music Venue Trust. It's a UK-based charity organization that protects, supports, and advocates for grassroots music venues. Christopher Naum, he's a co-founder of Listen Local First. I love that, a nonprofit organization that promotes and supports local music artists and venues in the DC area. He also is a vice chair for the Mid-Atlantic chapter of the National Independent Venue Association. That NIVA was instrumental during the pandemic and saving many venues in the United States from folding. So I welcome you all. My name is Randall White. I'm the founder and host of 24 Hour Nation. This is a news and information source for nighttime attenders and nighttime advocates. I do want to thank our friends with Nightcap First for their promotional support of today's web panel. We will begin with some discussion with Brian, Chris, and Mark, and then we'll provide time at the end of the hour for questions from you. This is also being recorded, and it will soon live on the 24 Hour Nation website and on our YouTube channel. Now, I'll be quiet and we will hear from our guests. I want to begin with Mark. Good afternoon to you, Mark. First, tell us about Music Venue Trust.
Well, Music Venue Trust is a registered charity. It was formed in 2014 and it's a grassroots up movement. We noticed that very large numbers of these types of venues that do a lot of work around new and developing talent that are really very vital to their local communities. A lot of them have been closing down. And very importantly, to understand they weren't being replaced with new ones, which was quite a big change in our sector in the UK. The traditional model was that maybe somebody would run one for 5, 10 years, and they might go, another one would replace it. But what we saw over a period of 15 to 20 years was a gradual decline in the number of trading spaces there were. Ultimately, when we looked at it in 2015, it transpired that more than 35% of all of the trading venues for artists to play at in the UK had been lost. So for the last 8 years, we've spent a lot of time working on understanding the reasons for that. What are the solutions for that? How do we protect them? How do we reopen them, frankly, in some cases? What's the impact when they're lost? How can local government, national government act together with the sector to prevent those losses, really?
And what is the role of authorities in managing entertainment-related sounds in the UK?
Well, this was one of the first things we learned, actually. We did a report for the Mayor of London in 2015, and we identified 22 reasons why a music venue might be lost to its local community, why the space would be lost. Underpinning those was quite a lot of deep core stuff about the way that they're viewed and the way that they're therefore addressed within policy and approaches by city governments or local authority governments, and in fact by national government. For example, when we explored the London Plan, which is the overall guiding document produced by the Mayor of London that effectively provides a regulatory guidance book for the creation of policy within London by the 32 boroughs, we could not find one single mention of music venues within the whole of the London Plan. There were mention of cultural spaces, there were mention of theatres, there were mention of arts centres, galleries, museums, but no mention of music venues, something that we were able to very quickly suggest should be corrected. Looking at all these different 22 reasons, and to this date, we've found another 5, so we're now at 27 different potential reasons. And normally a music venue closing will exhibit 6 or 7 of those. One key one is redevelopment, gentrification, the failure to recognize that that space is a cultural asset within city planning, within local authority planning. and essentially kind of what we might call the law of unintended consequences. So a city might adopt a very strong policy about the needs for housing, especially in the center of the city, and especially affordable housing. That will result in the development of spaces around cultural buildings in low-cost ways where perhaps they don't have effective sound mitigation measures built into them. And at the same time, the local authority won't recognize what it already has effectively, and therefore won't build in to the planning process protections for the existing cultural space or the cultural usage. And so fairly fundamental to about a third of the reasons why a music venue might fall under threat and eventually permanently close is the approach by city governance, by in the American case, state governance, or in our case, regional governance, and also by national government. And a lot of our work is about this type of webinar, frankly, trying to engage with people who make these decisions so they can understand, okay, you have a real cultural asset here. You have something that's really valued by the community. What policy are you making? What safeguards are you including within the policies you're adopting that effectively protect what you've got?
And so where did the agent of change come up in all of this discussion, and at what time? And we just talked briefly before we went live about the origins of it. I was unclear. So talk to me about where agent of change entered into the discussion in the UK.
Well, I'm going to ruin my own reputation here because a lot of people around the world think that I did it, but in fact, that's not true.
Oh.
Brian that I've met a couple of times now. I've met both the other panelists a couple of times, but Brian knows that we are magpies. We go around the world and we look for the best practice there is, and we're quite open about it. And people find it offensive when I say in the meetings that we're here to steal the best ideas that you've got. But that's what we're here to do. We believe there is an emerging set of best practice for cities, for mayors, for regional governance, emerging around this issue of how to protect cultural assets, how to incorporate them into plans for the future of cities. And actually, this first started in Australia. It was the first time I ever heard agent of change being applied to development around music spaces, particularly, and cultural spaces in general. I think Brian will correct me, but I think it was Music Victoria that originally brought this forward. And a person I particularly heard say it was a chap called John Wardle, who is now the live music officer for Australia. And we met extensively with them about how to embed agent of change principles into law, how to embed an approach to agent of change, which frankly, other panelists might disagree with me, that's probably more important. To have city governance understand the concept of agent of change and to therefore wish to act upon it is the number one thing that I would suggest everybody does, to understand that, okay, it is possible for us to protect what we have by asking people who want to change it to join us in protecting it. And that's the essence of agent of change.
So it's basically whoever showed up second modifies their existence to what was there first, whether it was a neighborhood that was there first and then a bar comes in, or a bar was there first and a neighborhood comes in. Is that correct?
Yeah, very much. And we've managed to get this implemented. We have 4 different national governments. In Scotland, it's a matter of law that you must apply agent of change principles. So you are legally required to do that within Scottish law. In English and Welsh law, it is part of something called the National Planning Policy Framework.
I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, and specifically, this can get very boring very quickly, but I find it quite interesting. Paragraph 176 of the National Planning Policy Framework specifically created an agent of change model in relation to music venues. And it's interesting because the only other types of usage of buildings that anything like that had previously been applied to in the planning policy framework was military installations and nuclear bunkers. And so actually, I'm quite proud of the fact that music venues are now in a category with the military and nuclear power. But I think it just goes to show, look, actually, you have to address every part of legislation. You have to address every part of governance. And that's why I say, look, my number one mission in anything like this is to get people who are in positions of power, key stakeholders, wherever they are, just thinking about, do I understand what I've got in my city? do I understand what the local community really values? Because that's not always what's in your email box. You know, in music venues, not many people who go to a music venue, not many people who go to a punk venue are going to spend their Monday on writing about how much they had a great time to their local councillor or their local mayor. But that doesn't mean it's not really important to them. And it doesn't mean that those venues don't have a role to play in creating the future economic viability and cultural sustainability of that place. And so just to be really aware of what you've got. And then when you're doing that, become aware of, okay, what might infringe on that? What might make the future difficult for that? Noise, I think, is how people most commonly see agent of change as a really important piece of legislation. But actually, it's equally important to think about exit and entrance, about transport.
Right.
You know, we see development coming in that effectively cuts transport off from a music venue that really relies on it. What's happening when, if you want to really develop an area, and it's going to take you 5 years, what happens to the music venue that's the other side of that area when you cut off all the roads and all the transport that's going to it? This kind of thinking needs to be really embedded in cities at every level of governance, because that way you end up not just with a policy or a legal requirement, you end up with a frame of mind. Wow, we have something fantastic here. This is agent of change principles can help us to make sure it's going to be here for generations to come.
Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about some how-to steps, I think, when I get around to Brian. And I think you've just given me a name for my future webinars. I'm going to call them Magpie, because that's exactly what we do. We take information elsewhere and broadcast it to the world. Chris, I'm going to speak with you next. Chris Naum in the DC area, a live music force in the DC area. You're also currently working on a particular policy in the District of Columbia. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing, how you got there, and how the role that maybe NEVA had in some of that. And you're mute.
Sorry. Sure. I'll get to NEVA in a second. Thank you. You know, I want to repeat what Mark said, in that I think it's important to think about, you know, oftentimes local governments are reactionary. They react to certain things rather than planning ahead. And when we're talking about planning for a harmonious living, hospitable living environment where you have people living in close quarters with music and sound, that involves long-term planning, thinking ahead. There are 3 things that happened in DC in the course of 3 years, right before the pandemic, that led to the creation of a piece of legislation that we're adopting, trying to adopt agent of change. And I'm going to go through them really quick. There was a call by the local council to get rid of busking and outdoor performers in our downtown area, near our sports arena downtown. Very loud area, very touristy area. The reason that is because over the course of years prior to that, when the musicians used to perform near the metro, and they would be able to plug in the plugs under the metro entrances, which were kind of covered. The metro didn't like that. They thought people were getting in the way. Other people were using for other uses, so they sealed up all the electric outlets there. Also, at the same time, in the downtown area, they basically instituted these regulations that said, if you're going to apply for a liquor license, you can't have live entertainment, because there was all this new development coming in, residential. So all the bars, basically, if you want to play to tourists in our downtown area, you can't play to them in DC, because there's only one place that has live entertainment in like the downtown area near the mall. So
Really?
Of course the artists want to be on the street. So the artists were playing in the metro. You know, there's buskers playing all around, playing to these tourist crowds. So you take away their indoor space, you take away them playing in the metro, which controls sound. So all of a sudden you have artists playing in any open space. And obviously there was a people were complaining about the sound. There was more of it. It was coming to fruition. I think, you know, we think that there was an issue. Anyway, I'll get to that in a second. So the legislation was passed by, or was proposed by council to try to criminalize this sort of performance, this outdoor busking. And when we did our tests and we went around with the community, we found out that the soundproof in these buildings that were built right down in an entertainment district were so terrible, with these giant windows with aluminum framing, that that there was no way anything. You could hear buses, you can hear everything in these buildings. So this whole entertainment area of the city was built with really terrible construction, really terrible soundproofing, and knowing that this was going to be the entertainment center. So anyway, we fought with the music community. We fought back against this legislation, got this legislation pulled. At the same time, there was, I don't know if the go-go busking or the go-go issue with T-Mobile. I don't know if you heard about that. There was a store that had been playing go-go outside for 20 plus years, and new residents moved in. They heard this noise, they complained, they got it shut down. There was a big backlash that led to the Don't Mute DC movement. So in other words, this new development had come up and tried to displace go-go, this place that had been playing this go-go music and doing it for decades. And at the same time, new development was coming up around our H Street corridor, which is an entertainment corridor, and new condos were being built, and these people moving into the condos were attacking the local venues that were there and were complaining about the noise. But the venues had been there for 10 years. And they built these new constructions, like with large windows and outdoor, really large patios, these extravagant like rebuilds, but in a place that's right, less than 50 feet, 50 yards away from the whole entertainment strip. So these three things happened together that said, we need to change all of this. We need to look around. We need to look at Mark. We need to look at what's happening in San Francisco, because they actually have a piece of agent of change legislation on the books that's really helpful, and say, what do we need in this city to prevent this from happening? And we came up with the proposal for what's called harmonious living legislation, which requires developers building in an entertainment district to build to a higher soundproofing standard. 2, it provides 2 different funds. If for retroactive, if you are an already existing venue that's been in the place, you can apply for one-time funds to like do additional soundproofing in your venues. If you are a resident that lives in an area that's having this issue, you can take certain steps and get tax rebates to do soundproofing within your own space if you want. And the 4th piece of the legislation is that if there are new builds within these entertainment districts, there needs to be lease disclosure requirements and mortgage disclosure requirements, saying that you are moving into a building that is in a higher, a louder area, an entertainment district. You cannot call, for regular nightlife activity, you cannot call, the police, you cannot call, the file complaints for regular nighttime activity. And 5th, to address the busking, we called for a survey of what's happening in our public spaces. Like, because can we make better use of band shells? Can we open up the plugs and the outlets back underneath the metros, so which are sound mitigating in and of themselves, so artists can play there and they can stay dry and they don't need to bring all these louder pieces of equipment with them. So this is a comprehensive piece of legislation. The full council has approved it to vote it to go to a hearing, but because we just had an election, the hearing never happened, and so now it's being reintroduced. But this is a piece of legislation that people around the country are very excited about and really interested in. And as for NEVA,
it's leading the way in many ways, isn't it? I mean, aren't there a bazillion other cities in the States, and particularly perhaps elsewhere around the world, that will be following this because they're looking for a model that they can adopt? Correct.
And I think this model, proposed by our council member, Brianna Nadeau, is very interesting because it is thinking about the community as a whole and creating this harmonious living space going forward. So I hope people adopt it, but I hope, I hope DC actually holds the hearing on this. There is a battle. Obviously, there's a battle with the developers and the people who are, and the council member who are in the pockets of the developers,
right.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to consider here. But
who's leading the charge? Is it the grassroots, or is it you said a city council person, or who's leading the charge on this particular policy?
It's a series of it's a number of council members, and it's the grassroots community. And
Where is staff on this? Where is staff on this in DC? Is staff supportive or
administrative staff?
Yeah.
They've been silent so far. I think they want to see, they wanted to go through a hearing. But But DC, there's a lot going on. Obviously, we have our own issues with with federal funding and our legislation. So I think it has been temporarily put on the back burner, but we're trying to get it reintroduced this year before the NEVA conference that's coming up.
Now, let me ask one. Speaking of NEVA, real quickly, the National Independent Venue Association, as I mentioned, did save a lot of nighttime venues, music venues, live music venues, really during the pandemic that we're about to go under. And but where are they now in terms of being supportive to other venues around the country that are working to address these issues of sound mitigation and good neighborness and harmonious living? Where's NEVA on this right now?
So what NEVA has created is a sound advisory task force that meets once a month, and we have each month we have people from around the country, from up to 20, 30 different cities that join the call to talk about the issues they're having within their community. So that could just be cities that are Asheville recently had their noise legislation, had their sound ordinance legislation redone. So it's talking about what were the best practices that were implemented, and people all over the country weighed in to help Asheville, with their new sound ordinance. So it's sound ordinance. It's how can we implement agent of change principles into new legislation. It's talking with individual venue owners that are dealing with lots of noise complaints for some issues, or festivals that are dealing with noise complaints. So it's not specifically agent of change focused, but it's really bringing all members of the community together to discuss how we can create best practices around changes in sound ordinances, agent of change principles, and best practices for venues. Even, venues need to be good players in the community as well. That's
right.
important.
And is that those calls limited to NEVA members, or if somebody wanted to find out more about that?
We bring in, it is mostly NEVA members. We do have experts and stuff come in. So if you email me, and I'm sure the email will be available, listenlocalfirst@gmail.com, I can include you in the calls if you're interested in sharing or interested in being part of it. We do bring other folks in.
Okay. And because I think it is going to take a full court press to get some people's eyes open to the value of our music scene in culture at night and how they shape and frame and our cities. And it's important. It's important. It is just important. So speaking of cities, Brian Block is the representative here from city government side, but he's also created a policy paper that's parked right now at the Nightcap website. You can go download it right now. It's very informative at nite-cap.org, and it's under their thought leadership tab. It's a document titled Planning for Entertainment Related Sound, and it really does provide best practices for crafting sound policies and comparing innovations to existing approaches. Brian, tell us a little bit about that. You wrote in this document, amplified sound is an integral part of a nightlife and entertainment establishment's programming and business model. This is completely different from noise caused by barking dogs, which annoys the hell out of me, loud neighbors, or after hours construction, which shouldn't take place at night in a manner that is disturbance and prevents people from sleeping. In contrast, however, nightlife related programming is designed to take place at night and has to be approached as sound to be managed rather than eliminated. Tell us about your policy paper, which, as I said, is available at the Nightcap website.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Randall. Well, I'm going to continue the magpie theme a little bit here. The paper is kind of based on both, 6 years of my experience managing entertainment related sound, but then talking to, sharing, learning from each other. That's what Nightcap is all about. And I think that's what we're all interested in doing, stealing, borrowing best practices from each other. The paper is based on some case studies that are, in the paper: Austin, San Francisco, Brisbane, Australia. And it also looks at Victoria and the UK around agent of change. So it's based on learning, sharing best practices, and trying to move that ball forward. It is called Planning for Entertainment Related Sound. And most cities don't have a strategy for managing entertainment-related sound. Instead, they've got, an outdated sound ordinance that, at best doesn't account for nightlife and entertainment and live music. And probably worst case, it sort of prioritizes eliminating noise over everything. And so, you brought up an important point that's, part of the paper, and I think a good segue. I guess before I do that, so how does that play out when you've got sound ordinance that really doesn't account for, doesn't make venues and nightlife spaces legal? The nightlife and venue spaces are still there. It's just that they're operating in sort of an environment of fear and uncertainty. And maybe the noise ordinance isn't enforced for a while until things change, and then it is. That's problematic. That's not a system that we want to be under. And so what we all saw starting in the late 1990s in the US, in the UK, in Australia, and Europe, is this trend towards urban redevelopment of the inner core and the inner city. Either it was abandoned and redeveloped or developed for the first time. And so that's how music venues and nightlife spaces found themselves dealing with with the lack of a system to manage entertainment related sound. They found themselves dealing with a situation that didn't account for them and didn't really allow for them to be legal and to continue to exist. So that's sort of the conflict that we've been in and that we remain in, and that we really need to have a comprehensive strategy for managing entertainment related sound that's proactive and not this sort of reactive. That's really what the paper is about. And it covers both sound ordinances, but also agent of change and residential quality of life, because I see them all as the same thing. They're not separate things. They're all a part of managing entertainment related sound. And I've got 8 sort of key components to create a comprehensive system. And I'm going to start with 4 of them because I think that's what you asked to start with, which is more of the regulatory side. And then hopefully I think you'll have a follow-up question and we can go into more. But and I think this is kind of similar to what Mark said. The first principle is really that nightlife and entertainment related sound is different, Randall, as you pointed out, from barking dogs and construction after hours. It's an important and a valuable part of our local culture and our local economy. And it needs to be seen as sound to be managed and not noise to be eliminated. So that's a philosophy and a perspective that really we need to start with. And that's just not the case. I mean, the regulatory systems don't see it that way. Now, the next kind of key principle is that the system, the sound ordinance, the sound regulations, they need to be tailored for entertainment related sound and live music and amplified sound. The systems we used for the barking dogs and after hours construction are not tailored to entertainment related sound. They need to have sound levels that are high enough to allow it to exist and, not be too high. And so they can continue to manage residential quality of life. And so we can have both nightlife, vibrant nightlife and entertainment and live music, and a livable city and high quality of life. We can have both. We deserve to have both. We should have both. So it needs to be tailored. A measurement and regulation system that's separate from noise from other sources. It should measure not just the high frequency, which is usually measured by dBA, but also low frequency, which is an important and the most kind of common disturbance component part of live and amplified music. So we should have dBC as well, or another strategy for measuring low frequency sound. The next principle is that this shouldn't be one size fits all, that our city has different districts with different intensities, different visions for the future, different levels of vibrancy. We have entertainment districts where the intent is for vibrant live music and entertainment. We have existing establishments. It shouldn't be one size fits all. It should be customized as much as we can for different kind of visions for different areas around the city. That can be done in a number of ways. It can be done by setting up entertainment districts. It can be done by like a permitting system for individual venues, but it should be customized as much as possible. And I guess the fourth one, and I think this is really critical, and it starts to move us into the agent of change, is the regulations for venues and nightlife establishments needs to be predictable. It can't be a constantly moving goalpost. So, right now we have a situation where either the venue doesn't have a legal sound level to rely on, or it's based on the nearest residential. And that sort of regulation, that bar keeps changing every time residential moves closer to it. So that really isn't a predictable system. What we need is venues to have something that's fixed and something that's predictable and that doesn't keep changing every time residential moves in near it. And so I think that's a big part of sort of solving this problem. And it moves us in a direction that Chris talked about and Mark talked about. When you start to, have regulations that are proactive, they're objective and they're fixed, they're customized, and they're meant to be long-term and predictable. Now the nightlife establishment's programming isn't expendable, right? It has a right to continue to operate that programming indefinitely. And now the other players and the other stakeholders who start to move in or who are in that environment, they also have some responsibility. They have to account for the fact that we're managing and planning for this entertainment related sound to be here for the long term at this level that we all agreed is the right level. And now everyone else needs to start to adapt to that. And so it puts some kind of, it creates a natural incentive, right? For now, the residential developer knows what the sound environment is going to be like, what the legal and compliant levels are, and they need to start thinking about adapting. If I want my building to be a certain sound level in the units, a certain residential quality of life, a certain level of livability, now it's my responsibility to do that. And then as you start to get into more policies to either encourage or incentivize or require that, it's easier to layer that on when the venue is already stable. That policy no longer has to preserve the venue. That policy now can be focused more exclusively on making sure we have the residential quality of life that we want as well. And so I'll stop there, Randall, because
Okay. And Christopher's got his hand up. Christopher, yeah. You might unmute yourself, Chris.
Yeah.
Well, Randall, should we?
Go ahead.
I want to go into agent of change.
Okay, we will, but let's take a break here
going?
for just a second. Like
Okay.
Chris he's got a point he wants to make here, and then we'll come
Great.
back. The other point I would like to make too, for those who are listening, is Mark, you're a music background, correct? And Chris definitely is a music background, but Brian is an urban planning background. So it's very interesting to have this different set of eyes on this topic. And I myself am a community advocate and economic development background. I got involved in the nighttime space because the city in which I live was creating ordinances that were going to be punitive to nightlife businesses, because in an entertainment district, new residences popped up because they were attracted to the entertainment district. And then the residences in those buildings suddenly began to eat their young, and I don't want to live here anymore. Well, it's why you moved there. So that's where I got involved in this whole time space. Chris, you want to say something?
I just simply wanted to jump on Brian's comment in that there's STC ratings is what's used around the country for sound transmission within interior walls, and almost every single city has regulations for sound transmission within interior walls. But it is rare you find sound transmission regulations for exterior walls. And that is an OITC rating. That's the biggest thing we found missing. And that goes into just planning. Like, how do you've got so much happening in these developments that are coming up, but you're not regulating sound from exterior walls, just between units. So I feel like that is the base of starting this discussion is, windows versus what type of material you're using on the outside. That really matters. And that's when we're talking about planning, what Brian was getting into. I think that is the crux of sort of development everywhere, is we need to come up with a more generalized standard for exterior wall sound transmission. Sorry.
Okay, Brian. Well, let's get into the how-to and the agent of change part, and take us into some of those next principles and the things that people can do, and what is agent of change from your perspective.
And I'll just segue, hopefully fairly quickly, from that last point and continue the thought. Once you give the establishment, the venue, a sort of fixed and reliable sound level, now you can kind of focus on, we all want the same thing, right? We want vibrant nightlife and entertainment and live music, and a livable city and high residential quality of life. Now the policy can really start to focus more exclusively on residential quality of life. And so that's kind of, you've got the agent of change approach, which is really valuable and important, and a critical approach if you're in an environment, say like the UK or like Australia, where you cannot give the venue a fixed and reasonable level of sound. You have to deal with it via agent of change to both preserve the venue and achieve the livable residential quality of life. In the US, I think we have a different opportunity. I think we have an opportunity to give the venue a fixed and sort of reasonable sound level. And then cities can approach it in different ways, right? So we can have some cities may say, we are prioritizing a livable and quiet unit, and we're going to have a strict building standard, and it's going to be required and enforceable. It's complicated to do that. And, one of the reasons it's complicated is because venues are all over the city. They have different levels of sound impact in their environment, and the buildings are different distances from it and have different things in between it. And so a one-size-fits-all standard is going to be too much in some cases, and the developer is going to have to spend more than they should have, or it's not enough in other cases, and it's really not going to resolve the issue. And I think that's important to keep in mind. And so what I'm kind of suggesting in the paper, and in San Francisco really has done this, is maybe less of a very strict requirement. And Brisbane is a perfect example. They have a very strict requirement. It's very extensive, and it does add significant cost. And that's because they're using that to kind of preserve an entire entertainment district rather than individual venues all over the city. So I think those cases are different. But what San Francisco has done, and what I think might be a good model in the US is, and these are the things that Chris talked about in the harmonious living legislation, is, okay, if you're within 300 or 600 feet of a live music venue, you are going to be required to do a sound study, hire an acoustical consultant, understand the sound impact where you're building, and they're likely going to make recommendations about how to keep those units to a livable standard. But it's then up to the residential developer to decide if and what they do to make those units insulated. But they also need to disclose when those units are sold or leased, that there are venues nearby, that they've conducted this study, And that's going to provide consumer protection. So now I'm going to buy this unit and I'm going to be, the developer knows I'm going to ask, we've got these venues nearby. What have you done to make my unit livable? What can I expect in here? And so then it sort of allows the market to handle that versus city government trying to handle that in every case by case. I'll stop there and let other folks chime in.
Let me ask this question. On this call, we have regulatory staff from several cities. We have nighttime advocates and associations. We also have some venues, nighttime venues and business owners, and some people from industry. If there were one thing you were to tell any one of those groups after this panel, here is one thing you could start doing now to move your community towards a position of adopting this principle like Chris has in DC and like is built into some other cities in the world, what would be one thing you could tell any one of those groups, city staff, nighttime advocates, or nighttime business owners? Mark, do you?
I would start by reviewing what you already have, because planning in cities and development of cities and community use of cities, especially conflicting usages, quite often covered in other regulations or in other intentional policies or in other documents that exist, but they aren't being used specifically to manage this kind of soundscape ecology issue. That actually what we do find in, especially in city governance, is there will be guiding documents and they will refer to the responsibility of developers or the responsibility of planners, etc. But they won't have been expressed in a way. I've learned to actually kind of understand, listen, the job of a developer is to try and make as much money as possible for the investors. And I don't, you can have a big, long political argument about whether that's an appropriate thing to do, but that's what they're doing. The question is, are we making it appropriately? Are they making the appropriate amount of money in the spaces that they want to build in the areas that they want to build in? Are they needing to do all the things they need to do in order to think, or are they cutting corners because we're not enforcing some of the restrictions we have? My one for music venues particularly, I would strongly encourage every music venue that listening to this, any city governments listening to this, review all of your cultural policy. And if you mean it to protect music venues, and if you mean it to include music venues, write the words music venues, because otherwise we're into interpretation. And we have 4 cases in the UK where a developer has said, well, actually, wait a minute, that's not what's meant by a cultural space. And because it's not clearly defined, because they're trying to make the maximum difference between the amount of money they need to spend and the maximum they can sell it for, then of course it's in their interest to reduce their liability for sound mitigation, for sensible planning, reduction of sound bleed between premises, etc. I don't even think they're doing anything wrong by doing that. I think we're doing something wrong by not really looking at what we have and saying, yes, we mean music venues. That would be my first. I would honestly start there. It probably sounds too simple, but I would honestly start there. I see lots and lots of local government and state government and national government legislation that specifically refers to theatres.
Right.
This city really cares about its theatres. Just put "and music venues," and
Right.
you will end up immediately with a legislation body to frame out everything else that we need to do. But it's that absence of recognizing, no, I meant music venues. I'm sorry, I'm now hammering on this point. We spent 9 months working with Scottish government on a piece of legislation, Agent of Change, which was specifically to protect music venues. That's how it started. That was the seed from which the whole tree grew. And when the day before it went to be legislated in Scottish Parliament, we examined the last version of the legislation, and it didn't mention music venues once.
That's typical in Europe, though, isn't it? I mean, it hasn't the club scene kind of said, we're part of culture too. It's not just opera, it's not just theater, it's not just ballet. We are part of a city's culture. And so include us in that conversation. Chris, what would you invite others to do, action to take, the people that are listening today after this panel?
I think I hear from venue owners and festival producers from across the country on a monthly basis. All of them share the same issue. And I'll tell you that in each of these cases, in each of these cities, market forces aren't working to solve this problem. It just is not, it is not working. You can't just leave it up to the developers. I'd say I'd push back on Brian a little bit, even when it comes to doing a sound, paying for like a sound some sound study. I mean, we really need to assess sort of, do we want to preserve our entertainment districts and spaces, or are we going to allow for the gentrification of the arts? And I'm saying gentrification because in a lot of cases, and especially in DC, this is moving out Black and brown artists from the areas where they perform, from the areas where they live, and moving them outside the city, making the city more expensive. Yes, the argument is we need development, and we need more development to increase, especially, affordable housing, and they try to pitch affordable housing against this issue, saying, oh, if you're going to require these type of things, then you can't do affordable housing. But avoid those arguments. Those arguments are false. They're not true. We need responsible, affordable housing in these cities. And the way to be responsible is whether or not you are putting it downtown or putting it in a quiet area. The people need to have a space that's comfortable, where they can live, where they can be, they can be quiet, they can have peace of mind. And the two should not compete. Putting a little bit of extra soundproofing is not going to cause, that big of an issue here. I think that we have to take all of that in mind. We do not want to push our artist communities outside of our cities, because then the reason people want to move into the cities disappears. And I think developers understand that. And hopefully the more we communicate with the city officials and developers and community partners and cultural or city planners, we can come to this understanding of the importance of creating this harmonious living environment.
It doesn't have to be either or, it can be both. Brian, is there counsel you would provide anybody listening to this call of some step they could take other than going to nite-cap.org and downloading your policy paper? What else could people do?
I mean, overall, I would suggest doing any of those 8 components of having a comprehensive planning for entertainment related sound system. Start on any of them. Actually, start on any of the first 7. Don't start on enforcement. I think that comes later. But I guess, I'll just kind of, continue the discussion that Chris and I are having. I think we're saying the same thing here, but I'm going to get into a little bit more detail. Once you sort of legalize the venue's programming for the long term, then, cities can start to make planning decisions. They can say, we don't want any residential near here, and we're going to set our planning framework to not allow it. That's pretty extreme, but it can be done. Or, we can say we're going to have residential here, but we're going to have a strict building standard. That strict standard, we do need to make sure that it's effective. And it can be a little bit of insulation can be effective if it's a little bit of sound impact. In Austin, we have a lot of outdoor stages and venues, and it's a lot of sound impact. And what sort of the research has shown is a little bit of insulation won't resolve that issue. And so to set an ordinance and have that standard and sort of be saying to the community, this is going to solve the problem, we need to be careful because it probably won't. You talked about STC, Chris, that's, measures generally from 125 hertz and up, which doesn't cover amplified music at all. OITC covers down to 80 hertz. The thing is, amplified music and live music, the prominent frequency is 63 hertz. So even OITC is not sort of geared towards protecting from amplified music. It definitely understates the sort of reduction you're going to get when you start looking at lower frequencies. So I want to be careful of saying we've got a solution that's going to solve everything if it really won't. And so that's where I think, especially in the US, we've got an affordable housing crisis. We've got a number of housing units crisis. To add, more to the development review, make it longer, make it more expensive, may not be feasible. But if, it may be feasible to say, we're going to put some guardrails on you and, we're going to add some personal responsibility. So there's just
What a
different
concept.
options for
Yeah.
different governments to kind of consider.
Right. What a concept, personal responsibility. And if it's somehow or another codified into, everybody knows what the rules are. Everybody knows what the rules are. You create a proactive plan, then people know what the rules are and they can work within that rather than it being so subjective. We've got a couple of questions here. I'm going to kind of respond to a little bit. One person on the panel is on the noise advisory board for another city in the country. She's very heavily involved in creating the new noise ordinance and was when you mentioned DBC as a level of measurement, I'm under the impression that it's hard to get accurate readings for DBC, and that's why few cities use them. Do you have any examples of where DBC is being used? Decibel, DBC is what, decibel? Where has it been used and how is it measured? It's not measured with phones, which I hear one city wants to activate, people being able to measure sound levels on their cell phones. I don't think that app's going to work, but go ahead. But where are there cities where it's being measured, used DBC as a measurement?
I could jump in on this one, Randall. Austin uses DBC, San Francisco, Brisbane, Australia, several cities use it where they have an entertainment district with customized levels for amplified sound. It's very easy to use. It's a measurement that's on inexpensive sound meters. It just does DBA is really geared towards the higher frequencies. It was created to sort of approximate the human voice. DBC weights more heavily the lower frequencies, which are part of live music and amplified music. We use it. It's easy to use. It's just as easy as DBA, as long as it's calibrated properly. DBC is almost always higher than DBA, so you need a more allowance for it, but it's easy to use.
Okay, and here's a question, actually a couple of questions I might ask of Chris. One has to do with festival grounds. I know that there were some complaints from an event this last weekend. It was a Project Glow at RFK Stadium, that the residual sound still annoyed people, and how do you manage outdoor spaces? And then also someone asks, in the Harmonious Living Act, is that what it's called? What are the information disclosure requirements for new developments? How does that look? How is it planned to be enforced? So there's a couple of Chris questions here.
Again, so for harmonious living, we need, the legislation needs to go to a hearing for a lot of the details, these details to be ironed out. So we're waiting on our chairman of our council to schedule a hearing date. And that'll be, the details will be in that. Everything you can look up now is the proposed legislation, which obviously again, the details you said will be parsed out as we go through the hearing process. But the first question, I believe, was around the festivals and sound.
Outdoor spaces. Yeah. How do you manage that when we're thinking a lot about indoor venues?
I mean, again, this is something we deal with NEVA on a regular basis. It's as much up to the people that have the space to be responsible in how you hang and how you adjust your sound as it is to the city be able to create reasonable sound ordinances. I think this is the issues that we're having. And I guess I want to say, like, a lot of the issues with this weekend did come around bass and sound, which is DBC, which I'm interested to dive into what Brian's talking about, because I also have heard what Jessica has said in the comments is that it's very hard to sort of put DBC into regulation. And I don't know that many people that are doing it, but I do want to look at what Brian has. I think there was a festival that happened the weekend before that was responsible festival owner, owned by an independent festival operator, and there was no sound complaints. So that I'm not going to say one person versus the other, but this was it was a different type of event owned by a much more international operator. And there were issues, but the festival the weekend before had no issues. So
Okay.
that's where that's going to go.
Okay. I'm going to ask this question of you, Mark, because it's from a club owner in the UK. States his club was open just short of 50 years ago. And over the decade, I faced different noise conditions, even with it changing year on year in favor of or against my venue. How do we get consistency? How do we get consistency in regulations?
Funny enough, like that sort of refers back to the previous thing about DBC. We're not overly keen on the use of blunt instruments of DBC or any other measure, frankly, because sound is subjective. One person's acceptable level of bass is another person's living nightmare. And so, actually, because it's so subjective, the things that can irritate residents or can be a problem for venues aren't consistent in that way. And I think that kind of goes to Martin's question, how do we achieve consistency when we have an ebbing and flowing population that may have different demands? I mean, the classic is of course when somebody moves into an area because they want to be around the vibrancy of a nighttime economy, and then their living circumstances change and they want to live somewhere quiet, frequently to do with finding a long-term relationship, and in one famous case in the UK, the birth of a child.
Right.
They moved into a city because they wanted to meet someone. They met someone in a nightclub. They got on so well, they then had children. Then they were upset by the amount of noise they had to live around. I mean, that's not an answer for Martin. I'm aware of Martin's case, but it's kind of demonstrates how consistency of policy isn't always achievable with some of the frameworks of law that we have in the UK. And I think this is the same around the world. Ultimately, in the UK, the primary piece of law that you have to consider is that within British legal framework, you are entitled to the peaceful use of your own home. That overrides everything else, no matter what else we do. And so actually, we are constantly playing catch up to that changing demographic and circumstances of cities.
I have two final questions here. There are several other questions. I'm only going to be able to get to two, but they come from nighttime managers in the U.S. cities, Brian, some of your colleagues. And one asks, one of my venues asked if there are any cities having luck with business self-regulation. Are we aware of any?
What does that mean on the business, the establishment?
I think so, in terms of sound self-regulation. Any cities really having luck with, okay, just be respectful?
I don't see that as a system that would work. I think we need to be respectful and good neighbors and go with a good faith attitude, but starting from a baseline of what makes the venue kind of long-term sustainable and legal and what the resident can expect. If there's no accountability and no expectations, I think you start to create conflict very quickly.
Okay. And
I think that also applies, can I just say, that also applies to the planning regulations.
Yeah.
The fact is, if you have a developer that wants to come in and do something, they will be, in the UK, certainly, they will be assigning parts of their legal team to work out how they do not have to comply with certain things that they're being asked to do. We need to balance that out with the regulatory framework.
Okay. And the last question, then we'll wrap up here. And I'm not sure what this means. Our building code attorney pushed back on AFC. I'm not sure what AFC is. You gentlemen probably know, because the building code regulates the active building, the venue, and not the passive building, the new apartment building. How do you resolve that argument? Is that clear, or do we need some clarification?
AFC, I'm assuming they mean agent for change as opposed to agent of change.
Okay. Okay. So the attorney pushed back on the concept of that because building code regulates the active building and not the passive building. And how do you resolve that argument? How do you get current city attorneys, and I know there's a couple on this call, to kind of understand that the new player can adapt? How do you do that?
I guess I would say it is within the city's kind of scope and authority and responsibility to create ordinances, if they so desire, to manage, to go beyond what's in the International Building Code. The International Building Code really just deals with kind of thermal issues. It doesn't deal with sound issues at all. But cities have done it, and I think can add those things if they desire. I don't think that would be a legal barrier.
Well, gentlemen, our hour is up. We could have a master magpie class, I think, just on decibel. Maybe we need to. We can really geek out, but I think that will need to involve a few cocktails. I want to thank Brian and Mark and Christopher, and I want to thank Nightcap for the support of today's program. Thank you for joining us. In June, 24 Hour Nation will have another panel on economic impact studies for the nighttime and cultural sectors. Sometimes you have to prove your value in order to get the support you deserve. You can learn more about that upcoming one at 24 Hour Nation. This is 24 Hour Nation. My name is Randall White, and I thank you for joining us. Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Thank you.